New Year's Eve, 1989. The air on the West Coast crackled with more than just electricity. It buzzed with a strange mix of hope, exhaustion, nostalgia, and anticipation for something not yet fully formed. The decade was on its last legs, limping toward midnight in a blaze of neon, synthesizers, shoulder pads, and big dreams. The 80s, with all its flash and contradiction, were exhaling their final breath, and the 90s were pacing just outside the door, not quite visible yet, but clearly about to arrive. There was a tension in the air, the kind that only comes at the end of something too big to fully understand while you're still inside it. People sensed that something larger than just a calendar year was ending, that an era was winding down. It was the end of a decade that had brought the world breakdancing, boomboxes, mullets, mall culture, Reaganomics, punk rebellion, and the full-blown birth of MTV, which had turned pop stars into icons and music videos into art. As the clock inched toward midnight, from the beaches of Venice to the hills of San Francisco, people were counting down, not just to a new year, but to a brand new cultural era. Across California, the energy was thick and kinetic. You could feel it in the streets, in the way people dressed, danced, and drove around blasting their favorite tracks. Parties weren't just happening, they were multiplying. In Long Beach, backyard barbecues buzzed with families and neighbors sharing beer, ribs, and cassette mixtapes featuring the biggest hits of the decade. Prince, Madonna, Janet Jackson, and George Michael poured out of boom boxes and home stereo systems, the music battling with the sound of laughter, fireworks, and clinking bottles. Downtown Los Angeles pulsed with rooftop parties and warehouse raves, where 20-somethings in sequins and leather jackets danced under strings of lights that hung like stars. House parties in the valley spilled out into the driveways and sidewalks, while in the Hollywood Hills, gated mansions played host to invite-only celebrations, thick with celebrities, hangers-on, and wannabe starlets looking for a last big break before the 90s hit. The whole coast felt like it was staging a farewell concert for a decade that had given them so much to remember and so much to cringe at. This wasn't just any New Year's Eve. This one had gravity. It felt historic even in the moment. There was a shared awareness that a shift was underway, and nobody knew what exactly was coming next. People were saying goodbye to more than just a year. They were saying goodbye to cassette tapes, rotary phones, Cold War fears, and the kind of pop culture excess that had made the 80s both brilliant and ridiculous. The Cold War had all but ended, the Berlin Wall had come down just weeks earlier, and David Hasselhoff, of all people, had performed in front of it in a light-up jacket while Germans cheered. It was surreal, and somehow it made perfect sense in the context of the time. Even if you weren't following politics closely, you could feel something different in the atmosphere. The world seemed to be turning a page, and the West Coast was riding that wave with champagne in one hand and a pager in the other. In San Francisco, where weirdness had always found a home, the clubs were alive. The End Up and DNA Lounge were bursting with bodies. Sweaty, sequined, half-dressed, fully hyped, dancing to pounding bass lines that blurred the lines between genres. The music was shifting too. Synthpop still dominated, but there were new sounds creeping in. House music, acid jazz, and the early rumblings of what would later become trip-hop and techno. DJs were spinning as if they were conjuring the future, unsure what it would sound like, but committed to being there when it arrived. People danced not just because they wanted to, but because they had to. It was a final blowout, a cathartic release of 1,000 late nights. Heartbreaks, new loves, and endless Friday evenings spent in line at record stores. The glitter on the floors was mixed with the sweat of a decade's worth of movement. And then there was Hollywood, the land of glitz and illusion, giving the 80s the send-off it deserved. The scene there was pure cinematic excess, over the top in all the right and wrong ways. Red carpets were rolled out, even if no cameras were around. Fake snow-dusted Sunset Strip entrances, while spotlights lit the sky like searchlights for the next big thing. At clubs like the Roxy, the Viper Room, and Whiskey A Go-Go, the guest lists were a curious mix of rock legends clinging to relevance, teen stars just breaking out, and everyone in between. You could find a glam rocker still wearing eyeliner from 85 brushing shoulders with a fresh-faced sitcom actor hoping to be discovered in the haze of cigarette smoke and overpriced cocktails. There were rumors in the air, whispers about the Seattle sound that was starting to bubble up, talk of bands that didn't dress like Motley Crue or dance like Paula Abdul. Something grittier was forming on the horizon, but not tonight. Not yet. On this night, hairspray was still king, eyeliner was still fierce, and every guitar solo still came with a wind machine and a scream. Further down the coast from the flashier chaos of Los Angeles, San Diego's Gaslamp Quarter became a lively blend of motion, music, and celebration. The historic downtown area, already known for its buzzing nightlife and gaslight-era charm, exploded into life with an eclectic mix of college students from UC San Diego and SDSU, Navy sailors on shore leave, young professionals, and families out for one last hurrah before the decade turned. Bars were packed shoulder to shoulder with bodies swaying to a soundtrack of Janet Jackson, Bobby Brown, and New Order, while restaurants spilled guests onto the sidewalks, waitstaff barely keeping up with the flood of end-of-decade appetites. Street performers and spontaneous dance circles turned the sidewalks into stages, and there was a collective feeling that, for one night, anything could happen. Farther up the California coast, the vibe shifted but didn't slow down. In Santa Cruz, beach bonfires flickered beneath a crisp winter sky. Locals wrapped in blankets and denim jackets passed around thermoses of hot cider and flasks of not-so-hot whiskey, toasting the surf and the stars above it. Down in Santa Barbara, the scene was a bit more refined, but no less festive, with beachfront hotel parties and swanky house gatherings spilling onto patios and porches overlooking the Pacific. Kids ran barefoot in the sand, while adults counted down the minutes on glowing watches and car stereos tuned to top 40 countdowns. Even in smaller towns up and down the West Coast, from Pismo Beach to Crescent City, there were block parties, bonfires, and last-minute grocery store runs for sparkling cider and whatever champagne was left on the shelves. Fireworks crackled up and down the coastline, their reflections dancing across ocean waves. Some were legal, many weren't, but nobody cared much that night. The goal wasn't order, it was release. There were drunken countdowns yelled into the wind, followed by wild applause and off-key renditions of Auld Lang Syne, often sandwiched between someone shouting about how great the 70s were and someone else insisting that 1990 was going to change everything. Inside homes, apartments, and beach rentals, families and friends huddled in front of bulky TVs, watching the familiar glow of Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve broadcast from New York. The ball in Times Square was still 3 hours away for them, but it didn't matter. People on the West Coast celebrated it anyway, as if joining the moment could bend time zones. Couples sipped Bartles and Jamie's wine coolers or popped open cheap bottles of Andre champagne. Parents let their kids stay up late, sleepy-eyed and jittery from too much soda, and the excitement of being allowed to bang pots and pans at midnight. There was a strange comfort in the shared ritual of it all. It didn't matter if you were in a hillside house in Berkeley or a trailer park in Bakersfield. Everyone was waiting for that glowing sphere to fall, marking not just a new year, but the beginning of something else entirely. Back on the West Coast, though, things had a different rhythm. The celebration was less manic, more laid back. The energy had warmth to it, a kind of California looseness that made the night feel like both a send-off and a sigh of relief. The 80s had been intense, politically, culturally, musically, and not everyone was sad to see them go. Some people were nostalgic already, while others were more than ready to hit the reset button. Conversations bounced around kitchen counters, record store parking lots, and late-night diners. Was Michael Jackson ever going to top Thriller? Had Prince peaked? Was Run DMC still relevant? Would Public Enemy get even louder? There was chatter about whether synths were finally dead, or if the strange, experimental stuff being made on computers in bedroom studios was about to take over. House music was still underground, but it was beginning to push into the daylight, finding a foothold in clubs from LA to Oakland. Kids who had spent the decade air guitaring to Van Halen were now bobbing their heads to early techno and acid house, wondering if this new sound was the future. Kids were up long past their usual bedtimes, bundled in oversized jackets, banging pots and pans in cul-de-sacs like it was their personal mission to out-noise the fireworks. Their parents let them roam a little freer that night, swept up in the communal energy. It wasn't just another holiday. It was the final few hours of a decade, and even the youngest could sense something big was happening. In the background, you could hear the muffled bass of stereo speakers thumping through suburban garage doors, the clatter of bottle rockets being lit on sidewalks, and the sound of someone inevitably yelling at a neighbor to keep it down, while clearly not planning to do so themselves. Older teens who had little interest in cookware percussion leaned into the mood in their own way. Some were out back, chain-smoking clove cigarettes like it was a rite of passage, the spicy sweet scent drifting in the cold air. Others stayed indoors, curled up next to their cassette players, making mixtapes they planned to hand off the next day, carefully curated love letters or soundtracks to personal identity, crafted from songs taped off the radio or borrowed records. These tapes weren't just playlists. They were statements, tiny time capsules made with a level of intention that felt almost ceremonial. Inside, families gathered around bulky TV sets, eyes locked on New York's Times Square countdown as if watching the official certification that time had, in fact, moved forward. Across the entire West Coast, people counted down with Dick Clark, even though the ball had technically dropped 3 hours earlier. And when midnight finally arrived in Pacific Standard Time, it hit like a jolt. Champagne corks popped, someone screamed louder than everyone else, kisses were exchanged, and pots and pans took another beating in a second wave of celebratory chaos. Fireworks lit the skies, legal or otherwise, and yes, more than a few went sideways, leaving singed eyebrows and scorched lawns. But nobody was surprised. It was part of the tradition. Even the cops, depending on where you were, mostly looked the other way. They showed up when absolutely necessary, but even they seemed to understand this night had a different kind of energy, one that didn't benefit from too heavy a hand. In the background of all the noise and glitter, global events loomed large. The Berlin Wall had fallen just weeks earlier in November, and its collapse wasn't just a news story. It was a shift in the atmosphere. People who'd grown up under the cloud of the Cold War felt the air lighten, if only slightly. There was a cautious optimism floating around, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things were getting better. On TV, live feeds from Europe showed massive crowds in Berlin celebrating their own New Year's Eve. And in one of the strangest yet most iconic images of the night, David Hasselhoff stood atop the wall itself, singing "Looking for Freedom" while wrapped in a light-up jacket. It was surreal, a little ridiculous, and somehow it captured the tone of the moment perfectly. Absurd, hopeful, global, and undeniably 80s. Of course, the West Coast never quite followed the national playbook, and that night was no different. While Times Square got the headlines, California celebrated its own way. In Venice Beach, people danced under laser lights and blacklight graffiti, spinning in circles on the sand as electronic beats spilled from portable speakers. In Bakersfield, couples made out in bowling alley parking lots as engines revved nearby and someone inevitably cranked AC/DC from a pickup truck. In Oakland, kids leaned over fire escapes and shouted, "Happy New Year!" into the chilly air, the sounds echoing between apartment buildings, bouncing down alleys, and mixing with distant cheers and the occasional car alarm. From coastal towns to inland suburbs, it was a night shared by millions and experienced in 1,000 wildly different ways. So, what was I doing on New Year's Eve, 1989? Well, I was 12 years old at the time, and it was a glorious little evening. We invited my best friend Erica's family over early in the evening for snacks and had a little joint party. Erica was one of 4 sisters, 2 older, 1 younger, together with 1 brother who was the youngest, and things often got messy, especially between the 2 older sisters who were constantly fighting for top dog status. Their reputation for cattiness was legendary, but that night they promised to behave themselves, sitting on different couches, giving each other the silent death glare from across the room. On a more civil note, we had chicken wings, cracked open some colas for the kids, and alcohol for the adults, talked for hours, and put on some music. The parents were talking about grown-up stuff, work, sharing recipes, our dads trying to improve each other's golf techniques. Us kids, on the other hand, were talking about the 80s, and wondered with wide eyes what the 90s would bring. Would it be like Back to the Future 2, where everyone would have flying cars and self-tightening shoes? Or would the premonitions of the Terminator movie lead to humanity's collapse in nuclear fire? Remember, at this point, the Cold War was still very much on, and though the wall might have come down, it was no guarantee that this global stalemate was going to thaw completely. Anyway, at around 11 p.m., we all got our coats on and headed down to Crissy Field for a firework display to bring in the new year. We were given color sparklers by a vendor, and there were cups of warm coffee and hot cocoa on sale outside the Palace of Fine Arts. Then, the magic moment came, and we all gathered at the waterfront to watch, from a distance, the fireworks rising above the Embarcadero. We could have gone down to the city ourselves, but we knew it was probably going to be carnage with the crowds, drinking, and partying, especially with so many kids in tow. Instead, we had something more intimate, a wonderful little moment watching the colors burst in front of our eyes. With the clock hitting midnight and the burst of explosions in the night sky above San Francisco, we had all said sayonara to the 1980s, leaving behind Ronald Reagan, huge hairdos, enough makeup to sink the Nimitz, power suits with shoulder pads so wide they could be classified as a wingspan by the FAA, and everyone using the term radical. What we didn't realize at the time was that the extreme decade was just beginning, and its stripped down, bare bones, anti-authority, anti-consumerism cornerstones would soon sweep away everything we knew. When the sun rose on January 1st, 1990, it brought with it pounding headaches, crusty streamers, half-empty bottles of Andre, and the obligatory muttered resolutions over burnt toast and orange juice. Some people went straight to the beach, chasing away hangovers with the freezing Pacific. Others stayed in bed until noon, emerging only for bagels and aspirin. But across the board, there was a shared feeling. A door had closed. The 80s, with all their flash and excess and cultural weirdness, were now officially in the rearview mirror. Nobody could have predicted what the 90s would really hold. No one knew grunge would dethrone glam, or that the internet would creep out of university labs and into every home. The kids making mixtapes that night had no idea they'd be downloading music from Napster in just a few years. But they knew one thing. They'd lived through the end of something. And on the West Coast, where weirdness is a feature, not a flaw, they made damn sure the decade went out loud, bright, and unapologetically over the top.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199 X, we're here just for you, for you.